Good morning, YouTube. Welcome to the Bubba Continuum. I believe it's November the 18th, Wednesday. I just felt like putting up another video. I feel like God keeps telling me things about the future and the rapture and all that. I'm not too aware of what's going on right now in terms of specifics. I felt like God told me a long time ago to stop reading the news. Like Smith Wigglesworth, he wouldn't have a newspaper in his house. I think reading the news is overrated. And it can cause a lot of stomach upset, and it can work against your faith. Very often you'll think something bad is going to happen because you're reading the news, and then God will turn the situation around, and it'll turn out that you were having faith for a bad outcome, and in reality you should have been listening to God because He was taking care of things. So I felt like God told me to quit reading the news, and then I felt like He was telling me, yeah, go ahead and read it during the election process. And I didn't enjoy that very much, and then I got away from it again. I felt like God was saying, all right, let it go. The election is the votes are cast. The official election day is over. So go back to your life. And that's what I did. But I have general ideas about what's going on in the world. And God gives me little phrases and things that turn out to be very useful, that help me to understand things. And this morning I was in prayer, and He gave me a phrase, and it was, they've gotten too filthy to be around. What was He talking about? They've gotten too filthy to be around. He was talking about the fact that merely being in the presence of people who are sufficiently depraved can be harmful to you. We're put in this world, we're kept in this world as missionaries, to try to reach people, to help people enter the kingdom of heaven. And in order for that to happen, we've got to be immersed in a world of sin, and we have to deal with people who have no interest in God day after day after day. In the past, this wasn't really that bad. America was a Christian country. Nobody really debated that. And we had basically Christian values, and there were decency laws and so forth. And persecution certainly existed, but it wasn't terrible. But all that has changed. And now we're surrounded by people who are so filthy and gross that just being in their presence is a problem. And we're not the first people to have this issue. The story of Lot, and if you don't know the story of Lot, shame on you. You should read the Bible. You should know what you believe. I mean, you can't call yourself a Christian if you have no idea what's in the Bible. Lot and his family were removed from Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, he was in Sodom, but Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because of sin, mostly because of sexual sin. But the Sodomites, and I'll just call them all Sodomites, regardless of what city they were in, because they're all about the same. The story is that they lived in very nice cities, maybe comparable to something like Los Angeles. I mean, places where everybody wanted to be. And things went well there, and they had a lot of wealth. And they didn't want anybody else to come in. They didn't want anyone else to share it. So they treated visitors extremely badly. They beat them and robbed them. And they had a mob mentality. There's a Jewish legend that says that they would, when someone came to town to buy and sell, people would rush up to him, and everybody would take one item. And because it was such a small thing, he couldn't prosecute anybody. He couldn't prosecute a person for taking one peach or one apple or whatever he had. But he would still be ruined by it. So that was their strategy. There was no remedy. And they raped visitors, especially male visitors. There's a story about Abraham's servant Eliezer. He went to Sodom for some reason. I don't know if this is true, but it's illustrative of the characteristics of the people of that area as they were understood by the ancient Jews. So he goes to Sodom, or maybe it's Gomorrah. I think it was Gomorrah. Anyway, while he's there, one of the people who lives there sees that he's a stranger. He doesn't want him around. So he takes a rock and throws it at him, hits him in the face, and Eliezer starts to bleed. So there's a big scuffle and a problem, and they end up in front of a judge. And the judge tells Eliezer, in our country, bloodletting is a medical treatment. So this man has given you a medical treatment, and you have to pay him for it. So according to the story, Eliezer hit the judge in the face with a rock and made him bleed, and he said, "Pay the other man what I owe him." So That's what Sodom and Gomorrah were supposedly like. Maybe I shouldn't smile and laugh, but it is a funny story. So anyway, we live in a country now where people are just incredibly filthy. They're disgusting. We used to have decency laws, and there were certain things you couldn't say. There were things you couldn't do. You couldn't walk around naked in public. Things are much different now. A lot of people don't know this. If you live in a place like, I don't know, Iowa, you may not be aware that it's legal now to walk around completely naked in places like New York and San Francisco. It kind of depends on your intentions in some cases. Nonetheless, it's totally legal. There was a court case involving a man who was walking around completely naked in San Francisco, and apparently a child saw him, and he was arrested. But he wasn't arrested for indecent exposure. What he was arrested for, I'm going to try to put this delicately, he was arrested for attempting to give himself pleasure using his hand. If he had just been walking up and down the street naked in front of children, they would have had no problem with that. But I guess as adults will understand what I'm saying. According to what I read, he was wearing a ring, and he was not wearing it on his finger. And what he told the court was, I was adjusting the ring. So it was okay for him to adjust this ring, which was not on his finger, in front of children, as long as he wasn't doing it for pleasure. And in New York, I believe the law says, as long as you're performing some kind of as long as it's an artistic performance, you can be butt naked in the middle of the street. And they actually do this now. I don't know, you probably remember there was a protest where people wore pink hats. I think it had to do with the Me Too movement, something to do with women's rights. They wore pink hats that were supposed to symbolize a woman's private parts, and I think you know what the hats were called. If you don't, you can look it up. And people in the news had to report on these ridiculous hats and call them by their popular name, which uses a vulgar slang term. So that's modern America. And this stuff really got started back in the 80s when AIDS took over, because suddenly we started talking about contraceptive devices that ordinarily, in the past, you couldn't discuss these things in front of your family without some kind of a good reason. You couldn't just, say, Mom, hand me a box of those devices. I mean, people would have thought there was something wrong with you. And suddenly the word for those devices became, well, it was mainstreamed. It became something that we said in front of children. And even in school, they teach kids who are too young to use those devices how to use them in the erroneous belief that education prevents AIDS. I mean, I'm sure it does prevent AIDS sometimes, but everybody knows what causes AIDS, and people still get it. You have to be living under a rock not to know what causes AIDS. What prevents AIDS is righteousness. That's really the only answer. Well, we live in a really filthy, filthy society now. And our terrorists, BLM and Antifa, it's amazing to me that most people don't call them terrorists. I keep saying this, they're using fear and violence and threats of violence and extortion to change people's minds about political things. And that's the very definition of extortion. Look it up in the dictionary. I'm not going to say that I sit around reading the dictionary. I didn't look up the definition, but I guarantee you that's what it is. These people are disgusting. They come up to people who haven't done anything wrong, and they use filthy language and say disgusting things to them. They say horrible things to the police, especially female police officers. I saw a police officer talking about things that he went through in Portland, and he was talking about this enraged, mouth-foaming mob that they were holding back. And one of these guys was telling a female officer that she serviced all the males in her precinct, and he was saying that he was going to take her nightstick and do things to her with it. This lady's just trying to do her job, So, what does it mean when God says they're just too filthy to be around? He's talking about the rapture. He's saying things are getting so disgusting here that it's no longer this earth is no longer a fit place for decent people to inhabit. That's really something. When you're so disgusting that your mere presence harms other people, you've got a serious problem. I was thinking about this, and then I turned on YouTube, which I do every morning, looking for stuff to watch, and I saw this guy talking about how brimstone and so forth had been found in the area of Sodom, and how it proved various things about the Bible story. Brimstone is sulfur. I don't know why we use the word brimstone. We ought to quit because people have no idea what it is. Sulfur. He was standing around by the Dead Sea, which is where Sodom and Gomorrah were located, and he showed the audience these round balls of sulfur that occur in the area all over the place. And these things are extremely pure. They're over 90% pure, and they're not found in other places. He also said there are these big sedimentary formations there, kind of like the ones in Monument Valley out west, except these are smaller. And some of them look like buildings, and some of them look like towers. And he would go over and dig around in the layers of sediment, and he would pull out these balls of sulfur. And he was saying things like these piles are made out of ash. And he was saying what happens here is if there's limestone, which is what they use in Israel for construction, that's true. If you take limestone and you heat it up in the presence of sulfur, you get something called calcium sulfate. And he was saying these piles, these big formations, are made out of calcium sulfate, and they're the remains of buildings. And then he went on and said things like some of them look like pyramids and houses, and they don't have natural shapes. And not all of what he said was convincing. One of the problems Christians have when they talk about science is they really go too far. If he had just said they have these pure sulfur balls that nobody can explain well, then that he would have been onto something. When he starts saying these formations, these sedimentary formations, are houses and temples and pyramids, that's kind of pushing it, because you can see similar things all over the world where presumably God has not rained destruction on people. On the other hand, the story about the ash, I looked that up, and that's actually true. If you heat limestone, calcium carbonate, if you heat it up in the presence of sulfur, you do get this calcium sulfate stuff, this gypsum, which these piles are made out of. So while I am dubious, I don't really believe, I'm not saying I disbelieve, but I don't really think these piles are necessarily houses and buildings. But it does make sense to me that if this place got hot enough and if there was enough sulfur, that piles of calcium sulfate could have been the result, could have been the end product. The sulfur, though, they haven't been able to explain that. And it's interesting because I went on the internet to check it out. That's something else that Christians don't do. They swallow things and they say, well, if it looks good for our side, we'll just keep passing it on, whether it's true or not. But I went and I looked on the internet to find out what the story was, and I found scientific papers. And it's funny because scientists don't like Christianity. And you can't really blame them. They don't believe God exists, and they see Christianity as the enemy of science, which it kind of is. I mean, a lot of people try to reconcile science with Christianity, and I don't think that works very well, because you've got one framework in which miracles take place, and you've got another framework in which everything has to have a natural explanation. So obviously there's going to be conflict. Anyway, scientists do a surprising amount of work with the express intention of disproving Christianity and Judaism. So I found some papers and stuff online, and people try to explain the presence of these sulfur balls. They say that maybe bacteria created them. And okay, that sounds wonderful, but the problem is they don't say this is what happened. They don't say we can reproduce this. Science generally should be something you can reproduce. If you come to a conclusion, you should be able to prove it somehow experimentally. And they admit in these papers this is just a possibility. So they don't actually have any explanation for these fantastically pure balls of white sulfur, which, as far as I can tell by looking at the internet, are not found anywhere else. Anyway, Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed largely because of homosexuality. And, not just homosexuality, but mob homosexual rape. Read the story. And I thought it was very interesting that I just happened to click on this video on this day when I'm thinking about how filthy the world has gotten, how crazy it's gotten. So So I believe that when the world becomes sufficiently depraved and sufficiently hostile, and it becomes a waste of our time to be here, God will pull us out, as he pulled Lot out, as he pulled the Jews out of Egypt, as he pulled Noah out. These things do happen. I do believe in a pre-tribulation rapture. And I think there are things in the Bible that suggest that believers will be here during the tribulation, but I think those are people either who were backslidden when the rapture came and didn't make it, so they had to make up lost time, or people who didn't believe in God before the tribulation and who came to believe in him after they saw the wonders and miracles, the suffering. It makes sense that there would be believers here during the tribulation. That has to happen, because otherwise it wouldn't be called the tribulation. Tribulation means crushing grain and taking the chaff, the hulls off, to get at the worthwhile part. And in Christianity and Judaism, that means separating believers from unbelievers. A tribulum is a device for, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, anyway, it's a device for removing the valuable part from grain, and so you can burn the rest. So you wouldn't name the tribulation after a process using a tribulum unless it had to do with a harvest. And if there's nobody down here that belongs to God, there's no harvest. So of course there's going to be believers here. But I believe the people who are close to God, they'll be like the church of Philadelphia. Jesus said, you will be spared the hour of temptation. And the hour of temptation is the tribulation. So we have this world getting filthier and filthier, and on top of that, suddenly we have this amazing technology which has taken away our free will, because it's putting us under surveillance all the time. It's going to make us so self-conscious that we're always going to try to do what we think will get approval from other people. And when you're under that kind of coercion, you don't have free will, then there's no purpose in the existence of the world. There's no reason for it to continue to exist, because this world is a place of testing and trial and purification. And if you don't have free will, you can't have righteousness. You're just an automaton. So it's like no other time in history. It appears that there's no other major country that will be a haven to Christians. In the past, there was always a place for us to go. And that's over with now. America is pretty well gone, and there's no other big country we can go to. You know, we've only got 2 big oceans. It's not like there's a third ocean we can cross and find another place. So people love to say, "Oh, things have been like this before," and it's never been the end of the world. The rapture has never come. Christians believe this stuff. Oh, they always panic. But the truth is, it's never been like this before. We've never had a population this high. We've never had this kind of technology. And people have never been this filthy all over the world, except for one time, and that was when God flooded the world. So I think we're coming right up on it. I really do. I keep doing little things to prepare, and I guess people may wonder why I do that. Well, because what if I'm wrong? You know, I'd like to have some food. I'd like to have soap, you know. I'd like to have ammunition. I don't want to be sitting here defenseless. So I do some things to prepare. One of the things I've been doing lately, I've been making beef jerky. I guess maybe that's not the smartest thing to do. A lot of people go out and they buy overpriced survival food. I just buy things that anybody can get, like rice and beans and canned corned beef, tuna, salmon. And I decided to make jerky because I like beef jerky. It's a good way to get protein. And I went on the internet, and I've learned some things that might be useful if you're planning to do this. It's really easy to make, but you have to have a dehydrator or some other means of drying out the meat. And I looked at various sources. I made the mistake of looking at Alton Brown. I don't know why I've ever listened to this guy about anything, because it just seems like he's always wrong. I mean, he ruins steaks. I saw him take a beautiful ribeye, and he cooked it beautifully in a pan, and then he cut it up and let all the juice run out. And first he rested it until it got cold, and then he cut it up and put it on a plate in slices and served it lukewarm. So, not a guy that I really trust. And then of course, there was the Shun Knives thing. He was the big pitch man for Shun Knives, talked about how wonderful they were. And then suddenly, he said he used them himself at home. And then suddenly they were gone from his kitchen, and he was using something else, and there was no explanation. And I got some Shun Knives, and they were terrible. They were very, very fragile, and it's just a bad idea to own a Shun knife. I mean, unless you want to pay $150 for something that does the job of a $20 knife, and then breaks when you put it in the dishwasher. They'll say, "Oh, you're not supposed to put your knives in the dishwasher." Well, yes, you are if you know how to sharpen them. Yeah, you are, because you can sharpen them back up in 5 or 10 seconds, and it's much easier than washing a knife by hand. Well, anyway, Alton Brown and I, we have a troubled past. And I looked at his stuff anyway. I thought, well, he might know something about jerky. And he said some things that turned out to be wrong. And I can tell you what they are in case you ever look up his recipe. One thing he said was you've got to take your meat and freeze it for like an hour so it gets firm so you can slice it as thin as possible. And there's two things wrong with that. Number one, you don't need to freeze meat to make it easy to slice. You need a sharp knife. If you don't know how to sharpen a knife, your job is to learn how to sharpen. It's not how to freeze meat and use your dull knife. So don't freeze the meat. Don't put it in the freezer. Sharpen your knife and get it to work right. The second thing is don't cut the meat as thin as it can possibly be, because you can cut meat really thin. And the meat, if you cut the meat like a quarter of an inch thick, it'll be perfect. Anything thinner than that is a total waste of time. It won't taste as good. It'll be like eating a piece of cardboard. It'll be a little crunchy. It'll be like chewing on air. That's one problem with it. And also, it takes up more room in your dehydrator. I mean, if you cut stuff a quarter of an inch thick and it takes up 9 shells in your dehydrator, then slices half that thin will take up 18 shells. Well, if you got a 9-shelf dehydrator, that means 2 batches. That means you got to go through the whole business, including the washing down and all that, twice. So it's a really stupid idea. Don't do it. Quarter of an inch is fine. He did get some things right, I thought. He said he used liquid smoke, and I thought, oh, that's the cheap way out. I'll smoke my jerky. So I made a batch and I smoked it, and then I said, boy, that's a lot of work. And then the next batch I made, I put liquid smoke in it and stuck it straight in the dehydrator. And really, for purposes of jerky, if there's a difference, I can't taste it. The recipe he provides, it's the same recipe that everybody on earth uses. Now call it their secret recipe. It's half Worcestershire and half soy. And then you can put in things like pepper and hot pepper flakes and, liquid smoke. Alton Brown uses onion powder. I use garlic powder. So, also something to sweeten it, like a couple of tablespoons of brown sugar. So they're all about the same. But one thing I learned that really, really makes a huge difference is that you should add like a quarter of a teaspoon of dry ginger, not fresh ginger. You need the sharp, pungent taste of dry ginger. Add it to your marinade before you marinate the stuff. His recipe calls for 2/3 of a cup of Worcestershire and 2/3 of a cup of soy sauce. So that's what I do, and that goes with like a quarter of a teaspoon of ginger. Another thing he said that was wrong, he said marinate your meat for 3 to 6 hours. Well, I tried, marinating the stuff for a time in that ballpark, and it was okay, but it didn't have the full flavor of store-bought jerky. So what I do is I put it in a bag with the marinade. First, I make sure it's stirred up in there. There's marinade all over it, and I put it in a bag in the refrigerator for about 24 hours. I mean, until the next day. Maybe it's 18 hours, maybe it's 16, maybe it's 27, but about a day. And if you do that, the stuff really gets into the meat. And you make sure you turn it over a couple of times and squish it around, because otherwise you'll get areas in the middle of the meat that don't get any marinade. So I've been making this stuff and going about 5 hours. I have a dehydrator that goes up to 155 degrees, and that's what I use, 155 degrees. And I go about 5 hours, and this stuff is perfect. The first few batches I made, I thought they were fine because they were as good as store jerky and cost about half as much. But since I've been adding the ginger, they're just off the charts great, and it kind of disturbs me because I'm afraid it's going to be so good I won't be able to stop eating it. So, hard times will hit, and I'll eat all my jerky in one day, and then I'm going to have no meat. It's great, though. It's great. So those are my suggestions. Cut the meat a quarter of an inch thick. Don't do what a lot of people say. Don't go 13 hours. Don't dry it out until it's like a potato chip. 155 degrees, 5 hours, it'll be perfect. Liquid smoke is fine. I'm trying to think if there's anything else you need to know. The meat that I've been using is eye round roast, which is like a piece of rubber. Cubans braise it. They call it boliche, and it's pretty good if you braise it, if you cook it until it finally breaks down. But generally, it's a nasty piece of meat. But it's great for jerky because it has very little fat. If you have too much fat in your meat, it will spoil. So I use that, and then I used bottom round by accident. I bought it by accident, and that turned out to be even better, although some oil came out of it after it was dried, so that makes me wonder if it has too much fat in it. So if it goes bad, I won't use it anymore. You can also use London broil. My understanding is all this stuff basically comes from the same part of the cow. So that's what's going on with me today. I hope you'll get closer to God and try to get away from our filthy, unbelievably disgusting social atmosphere. Try to be ready to get out of this place. It's really going to happen. I don't know when. I keep feeling like it's going to be this year. But regardless of when it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And you should live like it's going to be this afternoon, regardless of when it's going to take place. You should try to be close to God. You should try to listen. He's real. All these things are real. It's not made up. The things that Christians have been predicting about this year all coming to pass right in front of you. That ought to tell you something. I hope this will be useful to you. I hope you'll make it. I hope I make it. And like I always say, if you listen to this video and it does you some good and we end up going and we're at the marriage of the Lamb in heaven, tap me on the shoulder and say hi. Say, I heard your video. That's all I got for today. I hope you enjoy it. Have a wonderful Wednesday.